We are here today to honor my friend and partner Ben Mitchell as Banker of the Year, Perry Burgeon said from the podium to the applause of guests gathered in the Palace Hotel ballroom. Sitting at the head table to the right of the podium, Ben tried to look both humble and pleased. In fact, he would rather be anywhere but here. Recognition and publicity caused him great discomfort, but he couldn't deny that it felt good to be recognized for the dream he worked so hard to make a reality. At least, he reasoned, it's good advertising for the CFB. Community First Bank was an idea he had been developing and refining since his student days. Instead of creating a bank that competed for large corporate accounts, Ben built a business model focused on serving individuals and families. "We invest in people" was the bank's slogan. Many people told him that retail banking was dead. In fact, when he presented the idea as a college coursework in banking and finance, the professor gave him a failing grade, saying, "Your idea will never work." Even Perry Burgeon, a finance student and friend, had doubts about success. Basically, everyone hated his plan, except for the people in his target audience. In an era of impersonality, they loved the personal service that Ben offered. They took advantage of his small business loans and personal lines of credit and regained his trust with surprisingly low default rates. As a result, Ben's bank, which he idealistically named Community First Bank, became profitable well ahead of projections, growing at a pace that surprised industry analysts. Now everyone said that it was only a matter of time before one of the big players came knocking with an offer to buy the bank. Such a takeover could have been extremely profitable for Ben, but he had no interest in selling because he believed so strongly in what he was doing. As Perry continued his speech, his wife returned to her seat next to him and handed him a cup of coffee. Ben smiled and kissed her quickly in gratitude. His passion for coffee was almost his calling card. He always had a cup or mug in front of him. Of course, not everything was easy for Ben, Perry continued from the podium. He had to overcome great difficulties along the way. Hearing Perry's words, Ben thought wistfully, they don't know the half of it. As a child, Ben Mitchell made 3 important decisions in his life. Teenagers often make these kinds of decisions, but unlike most, Ben actually stuck to his own. His first big decision was to give up alcohol completely. The reason was simple. His mother was an alcoholic. When Ben was still in elementary school, she coped with her responsibilities quite well. She started drinking only at dinner, then continued until she fell asleep and Ben's father carried her to bed. Over time, alcohol at dinner moved into cocktails at lunch. As this became the norm, Ben quickly learned to avoid her as much as possible in the evenings. He'll never forget the time he didn't finish the chili she made for lunch, and she drunkenly threw the rest of the food in his face. The father did not turn a blind eye to the problem and tried many times to change the situation, but to no avail. He took bottles of alcohol from her and poured the contents into the sink, but she became even more resourceful in hiding them. He took money from her for entertainment, but she replaced it with a grocery budget. When interventions and sessions with psychotherapists failed, Ben's father was forced to accept the bitter truth. He could only save his wife if she wanted to help herself. Unfortunately, she categorically refused to admit that she had a problem. Then the father turned his attention to his son, trying to protect him as much as possible from the consequences of his mother's illness. Although his career at the bank was promising, Ben's father turned down several offers of promotion to remain at the bank branch located near his home. He wanted to be close to his son in case he needed him. There were several occasions when Ben's mother forgot to pick him up from school. Later, when her driving became dangerous, her father sold her car and Ben began driving a school bus. His father's precautions paid off the day Ben returned home from school to find the front door open and the house empty. With tears in his eyes, he called his father, who hurried home to his son. After unsuccessfully searching the area, the father called the police. 3 days passed before she was found sleeping in a downtown homeless shelter. Even worse, she refused to come home, which hurt both father and son, albeit in different ways. Ben's mother never returned home. A year later, police found her unconscious under a bridge. By that time, Ben's father had divorced her for leaving the family. But she was still his mother, so father and son went to visit her at the charity hospital where she was being treated. Ben remembered for the rest of his life what a person looks like dying from cirrhosis of the liver and vowed never to touch alcohol while he lived. Coffee became his drink instead, and he was rarely seen without a mug in front of him. Ben's second big decision was to become a banker like his father. His father had always been an example to him, and as his mother moved further away from Ben's life, his father became an even more important figure for him. So it's no surprise that Ben decided to be like his father when he grew up. However, the path to this was not direct. During his teenage years, Ben, like many of his peers, rebelled against his father. Things escalated during my first year of college. Ben attended a local state college and lived at home to save money. His father expected Ben to follow the same rules as in high school, and this seemed like a restriction on Ben's freedom. After losing his wife, Ben's father, unsurprisingly, became overprotective of his son. After a semester full of tension, the conflict came to a head during the holidays. Already dissatisfied with his father's restrictions, Ben became completely outraged when the newspapers reported a banking scandal. This was enough for the young idealist to decide that his father was part of a conspiracy of bankers to oppress the poor. To express his disdain, Ben boldly declared that he would not participate in the festive events because the season is simply a capitalist conspiracy between retailers and bankers who take advantage of the naivety of the poor. Instead of arguing, Ben's father put him in the car on Christmas Day and drove him around one of the poor areas of the city. He slowed down and pointed to a small house on one side of the street. "Do you see this house? I arranged a loan that allowed the owner to buy it," he told his son. "But it's a run-down house in a terrible neighborhood," Ben exclaimed. "Maybe," his father admitted, "but it's his house and he works hard to keep it in order. Moreover, he accumulates capital, which means that, with any luck, he will return the money invested and make a small profit. Isn't that worth something to him?" Winding through the neighborhood streets, his father passed a house with a 3-year-old car in the driveway. "I helped lend the woman who lives there enough money to buy this car," he said proudly. "So what? She bought a used car, now she also has a loan on it, along with all the other bills," Ben snapped. The father nodded seriously. "That's right, Ben, but buying that car meant she could get a better job in another city, which meant more money for her family. And here's something else. If she financed her car through a dealer rather than through our bank, she will likely pay significantly more each month." The next house they passed had a large tow truck parked in the driveway. "Our bank lent him the money to buy this truck several years ago. He now has his own towing business and has been making good money for his family since he got involved with AAA. Of course, the bank charges interest on the loan, but don't think that we are exploiting it. This loan means he has a chance to achieve something." After he gave several similar examples, Ben's father turned the car back towards the house. "Banking and lending are like anything else. They can do good or harm," he told his son. "But if done with integrity and honesty, banking is a lever that can help people do more than they thought possible." Ben didn't say anything on the way back, but it was clear to his father what his son was thinking about what he saw. Sure enough, the following semester, Ben switched his major to business and began taking courses in banking and finance. He would later tell people that his Christmas trip helped set him on this path. That same excursion helped change Ben's view of his father. He previously saw his father as an inflexible parental figure who did not understand his son's needs. But his father's enthusiasm for his work gave Ben a new perspective on his father's personality. At first, Ben simply asked his father questions about banking and his office work. After some time, he began to ask his father's opinion on a variety of issues. Finally, he dared to ask about his mother and learned about his father's carefully hidden pain and the shame he felt for not being able to save his wife from her addiction. Ben treasured this new closeness between father and son, and he was even more grateful when, during Ben's sophomore year of college, his father had a massive heart attack and passed away. Ben's sense of loss was at least partially alleviated by the closeness he developed with his father in the last year of his life. After the funeral, Ben found that he had even more reason to be grateful to his father when he learned that he was the beneficiary of a hefty life insurance policy. The money was enough to allow Ben to finish college and start a career with a decent amount of savings. Many young people would be tempted to travel the world and enjoy life to the fullest before starting work. Ben had other plans. The money donated by his father became the starting capital to finance Ben's dream, opening his own bank. This also allowed Ben to implement the third decision he made. Ben made this decision during his sophomore year of high school. He signed up for a community service project at his school, and on the day a group of student volunteers met for the first time, he saw Elizabeth Pearson. Afterwards, he couldn't say exactly what had happened, but he was so stunned by her appearance that he didn't hear the group's sponsor call out to him. The other children laughed, and Elizabeth turned to look at him too. Ben blushed furiously and looked at the registration sheet in front of him. When he finally dared to raise his head, he found Elizabeth still looking at him with a strange expression on her face. After the meeting, Ben was still confused, but before he could run away, Elizabeth suddenly appeared in front of him. "Why were you looking at me like that?" Faced with this vision of the opposite sex, Ben's mind lost all capacity for rational thought. To his horror, he heard himself blurt out, "I thought you were the girl I would want to marry someday." He then covered his mouth with his hand, as if trying to stop his words before they could escape and humiliate him further. Elizabeth looked at him in shock and said, "This is so funny." Ben wanted to die on the spot, but something in the tone of Elizabeth's voice made him stop and listen. She looked at him very solemnly. "I thought the same thing about you." From that day on, they became a couple. At first, their romance was a source of great amusement among their classmates, but they both paid no attention to anything but each other. After a while, it simply became an accepted fact that Ben and Elizabeth were together and would always be that way. When Ben's father found out about their relationship, he became worried. "I would prefer it if you dated different girls from your class. This way you will learn more about them and about yourself," he told his son. Ben didn't even argue, his decision had already been made. However, when Ben's father met Elizabeth, he felt much more confident in his choice of son. The girl had a kind character, behaved well, and was constantly on the honor board at school, and he had to admit, she was definitely attractive. She was tall and slender. In fact, when they first met, she was an inch or two taller than Ben because she went through a growth spurt early. She had red hair that reached her shoulders and perfectly framed her beautiful face. "She's a real American girl," Ben's father thought with admiration. Seeing how strongly Ben and Elizabeth felt about each other, Ben's father took his son aside and tried to lecture him about responsible sex. After arguing about this, he finally said, "What I'm trying to say is that neither of you want kids right now." Ben simply grinned and put the man out of his misery. "It's okay, Dad. You don't have to worry about it. Elizabeth wants to wait to have sex until we're married, and I promised her I would." His father left the conversation extremely relieved that it was over, and even more impressed with his son's girlfriend. "I wonder if they can keep that promise," he thought, remembering how he felt when he was a teenager. There was never any doubt that they would both go to the same college, and given their excellent grades, there was no doubt that they would both be accepted. By then, they had been dating for so long that both of their families felt completely comfortable with the two of them moving away together. Even their plans to move in together after their freshman year didn't raise any alarms. The master plan had long been drawn up. They would get married immediately after graduation. But as they say, men plan and gods laugh. The sudden death of Ben's father changed everything. Ben dropped out of school for a semester and returned home to attend the funeral, sort out his father's estate, and grieve for the man whose importance in his life was rivaled only by Elizabeth. She also wanted to drop out of school to help Ben, but he didn't want to hear about it. "There's nothing you can do. It is my responsibility, and I intend to spend all my time on what needs to be done so that I can return to college next semester. You will stay in school and graduate on time," he told her. Reluctantly, she did so. As the weeks went by, Elizabeth's friends on campus urged her to go out and have some fun. After some time, she did this, believing that Ben would not want her to become a recluse. When she started showing up at parties and events on campus, it didn't take long for some men to hit on her. At every invitation, she was unfailingly polite and unbendingly strong. She belonged to Ben and would wait for him. As for Ben, he avoided communication altogether. His grief made him reluctant to party, and when he was able to do so, he went to college to be with Elizabeth. It was during one of these visits that everything changed. Losing a parent is a big blow at any time, but sudden, early loss is even more difficult to cope with. Intellectually, Ben knew this, so he wasn't surprised at how depressed he felt. What he didn't expect was how submissive Elizabeth became. They both missed each other terribly, but Ben expected Elizabeth to be happy to see him. Instead, she was reserved and quiet. They went out to dinner together, but instead of going to the dance afterwards, Ben drove her back to the studio apartment. They sat down on the couch together, and Ben held her shoulders so he could look her in the face. "What is it, baby? I know this has been almost as hard for you as it has been for me, but is there anything else that's bothering you? It's okay, you can tell me." She looked at him and tears began to well up in her eyes, scaring Ben. "Your father's death was such a shock to me," she said quietly. "He was a wonderful person. He was so nice to me and—" At this, she began to cry so hard that she could not continue speaking. Ben's eyes were also watering, but he still couldn't understand what Elizabeth wanted to say. She blew her nose into a tissue and then tried to pull herself together. "It was so unexpected and scared me," she continued. He pulled her close to comfort her, and she let him hold her for a minute or two before gently pushing him away. "The thing is," she said, "what if it was one of us?" "Oh, baby, no. Don't think about such things. We are both young and healthy." "Don't worry," he said, trying to calm her down. "But something could have happened," she said stubbornly, "and I couldn't help but think about it." She stopped, and Ben saw a look of determination appear on her face. "Anyway, I've decided. I don't want to wait any longer. I want you to make love to me right now." With these words, she began to breathe heavily and then rushed at Ben. Ben was caught off guard and struggled to understand the sudden change. "But I promised," he said, trying unsuccessfully to hold her back. "To hell with the promise," she growled. "I want you to take me now." With these words, they began to have sex. There were no thoughts then, only an animal instinct that urged him to mate with his female. When their breathing returned to normal, he lifted himself up enough to look at her face. To his shock, he saw that she was crying again. "Did I hurt you?" he asked in panic. "Oh no," she said quickly. "I'm so happy. Now, no matter what happens, we made love to each other." He laughed with relief and hugged her to him in his own happiness. After this, they both realized that they had not used any protection, and they had to endure several anxious weeks before Elizabeth returned to her periods. From that moment on, they agreed that they would always use protection. Even though he was only away from college for one semester, Ben still had a hard time catching up. Not only did he have no practice in his studies, but many of the courses he needed were not even offered in the second semester. He ended up having to go to summer school. When he saw how well it went, he decided to do the same the following summer, and this allowed him to catch up with Elizabeth and graduate with her. They were married in the campus chapel 3 days after graduation. Kissing his beautiful bride, he whispered in her ear, "Remember that day in high school? Best decision I've ever made." Before opening his own bank, Ben decided to take a job at a traditional financial institution to gain some hands-on experience and, hopefully, gain insight into what he would need to do differently when he finally ventured out on his own. His grades and his father's connections helped him land a position as a trainee manager at one of the large local banks. Ben set to work with enthusiasm, hoping to absorb as much information as possible. This attitude made the arduous and routine entry-level work he was given more bearable. However, he couldn't wait to start making his dream come true. Elizabeth majored in education and managed to get a teaching position in an elementary school. Even though the school was in a low-income area, her patience and loving nature quickly won over the children in her class. Together, they earned enough to get by without Ben's inheritance. He offered to put some of the money towards the down payment on the house, but Elizabeth insisted that they save the funds to open Ben's bank. "We'll have plenty of time to buy a house when your bank becomes a big success," she told him. Ben and Elizabeth's married life was filled with challenges and pleasures, and sometimes both. Elizabeth, for example, was something of a medicophobe. She always hated going to doctors, afraid that they might find something wrong with her. When she was scheduled to have her first gynecological exam since their wedding, Ben came home from work to find her furious about the upcoming exam. He decided to console her with sex. After a few minutes of catching his breath, Ben stood up and looked at his beautiful wife with a smile. "I hope your exam tomorrow doesn't look like this." She smiled faintly. "Well, considering my gynecologist is a woman, I think you can be sure of that." Ben went to work the next day, pleased with himself and how well he had dealt with Elizabeth's fears. So he was stunned to return home in the evening to find his wife in tears. "She said she found something that looked suspicious," Elizabeth said, sobbing. "She wants me to see a specialist immediately." Fear shot through Ben, but he managed to hide it by hugging Elizabeth to comfort her. "Everything will be fine," he said. "Doctors always play it safe. Most likely, it's nothing serious." But it still turned out to be something serious. A petrified Ben held his wife in his arms as the oncologist delivered the shocking verdict: ovarian cancer. "We want to operate on Elizabeth early next week," the doctor said. "We want to be aggressive and remove everything before the disease has a chance to spread." Elizabeth curled into Ben's arms, and he felt the need to ask the question he had been dreading. "What exactly will the operation involve?" The doctor looked at him with sympathy. "We won't know for sure until we start the operation. Hopefully, all we have to remove are the ovaries." Ben felt Elizabeth tense in his arms. They both wanted children so badly. The closer the day of the operation approached, the more Ben was surprised at Elizabeth's reaction. While fear haunted him day and night, she seemed to find peace. Instead of the anxiety that usually took over her, she became peaceful, which seemed incredible to Ben. He didn't dare ask her directly, but she sensed his anxiety and tried to help him understand her condition. She had always been afraid of the medical unknown, she explained. Now that the worst had happened, she had nothing to fear anymore. The operation was a success, and the oncologist was very relieved to tell Ben the results. "I think we removed everything," he said. "By luck, she will be able to live cancer-free for the rest of her days." However, luck seems to have decided to take a vacation. When Elizabeth returned for follow-up examinations, the results were disappointing. To make matters worse, the cancer has now spread to her liver. Doctors prescribed a course of chemotherapy, which greatly worsened her condition, but had no significant effect on the disease that was slowly spreading through her body. Treatment with another type of chemotherapy was attempted, but the result was the same. Elizabeth's life became a cycle of treatment, illness, and bed rest that seemed to repeat itself endlessly. Ben's life became a nightmare in which he was forced to show up to work just long enough to keep his job and his precious health insurance, leave to care for Elizabeth, take her to the hospital for treatment, keep in touch with her parents, and still support them. House. Although he would never admit it, he suffered almost as much as his wife, especially from the guilt of being a healthy partner. Elizabeth had just completed another round of chemotherapy, and Ben was by her side when the oncologist came to report the results of her examination. The expression on his face was eloquent enough to convey bad news. "There is something you might want to consider," the doctor suggested. "Promising work is underway at Stanford on a new approach to treating cancer. Elizabeth would be a great candidate. If you agree, I think I can arrange for her to participate in the clinical trial they are starting." "Let's try it, doctor," Ben said enthusiastically. "Perhaps this is just what Elizabeth needs. I read about it on the internet and—" "No," Elizabeth interrupted sharply, so that Ben and the doctor were stunned. "I don't want this." "But honey, this is advanced technology," Ben argued. "Perhaps this is what will cure you." "No," she repeated more calmly. "I don't want to go through this anymore. No more hospitals, no more procedures, I just want to go home." Ben felt his throat tighten, but he forced himself to say the words. "But if you do this, that means." "I know what it means, Ben, and I've come to terms with it. All I want now is to sleep in my own bed, be in my own neighborhood, and feel and see life as I remember it, not as it is now. Please." By this point, Ben could no longer speak. All he could do was sit next to her and peer into her face, hoping for some sign that she would change her mind. But this task became impossible when tears blurred his vision and streamed down his face. "I understand, Elizabeth," the doctor said quietly. "I'll arrange help for you and Ben." The hospice nurse was an older woman with extensive experience caring for the dying. Elizabeth liked the nurse and talked to her a lot. Ben took comfort in knowing that Elizabeth was in good hands, and the nurse's visits gave him the opportunity to go to work, which became a lifesaver for him. One day, he was at his workplace when the nurse called. "I think you should come home right now," she said in response to his anxious question. "I think the time is near." When Ben entered the bedroom, Elizabeth was lying in bed in a clean nightgown. Her red hair spread across the pillow, forming a copper halo around her face. She was so quiet that Ben wondered if he was late, but then her eyes opened, and when she saw him, she smiled. "Come to me, my dear," she said in a weak but clear voice. He came and sat down next to her on the bed. Even the slight contact of her body against his thigh reminded him how little of her was left. He gently took her hand in his, and she gave his hand a weak squeeze. "You were the best husband I could have asked for," she said quietly. "I'm so happy that we found each other. I wouldn't change anything." "Oh, Elizabeth," he sobbed. "You are my dream, my ideal soulmate." His voice trembled with pain. "How can I live without you?" She smiled, but then her face became serious. "This is what I want to talk to you about, Ben. I want you to promise me two things." "Anything, honey, anything," he said through tears. "I want you to promise me that you will make your dream come true and open your own bank. I always believed in you. Promise me that you will do this for my sake." I I promise," he said with difficulty. She smiled. "The second thing I want is for you to find someone else who will love you and take care of you when I can't do it anymore." He pulled away abruptly, his eyes filled with horror. "Don't make me say it. I will never be able to." He cried so hard that he couldn't finish his thoughts, but she understood. "Yes, you can, and someday you will meet her. When that happens, I want you to give her all the love you gave me." "No, I can't." "Benjamin, listen to me," she interrupted, her voice so firm that Ben fell silent and stared at her in surprise. "You have to promise me," she continued. "I won't be able to leave in peace if I don't know that you will continue with your life. Now promise me." "Okay," he managed. "I promise." With these words, he laid his head next to her hand, still holding on to it, trying to calm down. A minute later, he was shocked by a hand on his shoulder. A hospice nurse stood nearby. "Now she is at peace. Say goodbye and then give me some time to get her ready." He realized that the hand he was holding was cold. He leaned down and kissed his wife one last time, then struggled to his feet and walked out of the room into a new phase of his life, life without Elizabeth. Ben later said that the only thing that kept him sane during that time was his determination to open his own bank. A few days after Elizabeth's funeral, he quit his job and began preparations to create the bank he had dreamed of for so long. Determined to keep his promise to Elizabeth, he was eager to get down to business as quickly as possible. The first thing he did was call Perry Burgeon and persuade him to join him. They discussed Ben's plans many times in college, and although Perry did not have the same vision as Ben, he believed in his friend. Using money from Ben's inheritance, the two men set about creating a new bank. The first task was to choose a name. Perry jokingly suggested calling it Umptient's National Bank, since all the other numbers were already taken. But Ben wanted a name that would set them apart and reflect their philosophy. If you want to open a bank to help the community, let's call it First Community Bank, Perry suggested. I like it. You get the idea of community right, Ben replied, but our bank will be focused on helping people in our community, so let's call it Community First Bank. This is how CFB was born. Almost everything about CFB was non-standard. While large banks moved quickly to electronic banking, Ben opened small branches aimed at working-class areas. Instead of the marble and granite buildings that his competitors were erecting, Ben chose to rent abandoned gas stations and closed fast food restaurants. Rent was virtually zero, parking was always plentiful, and Ben was able to carry out an inexpensive renovation through clever design and use of materials. To grow his deposit base, Ben competed not only with other banks, but also with payday loan and auto loan companies. CFB offered many of the same services, but without the predatory rates that defraud the poorest people. Word gradually spread that CFB was honest and fair, and the customer base grew. The initial return on assets was low, but Ben was willing to be patient. Following the example set by his father, Ben specialized in small loans to help people keep their jobs or start a new business. CFB has quickly developed a reputation as the place to go for small companies for short-term working capital. Roofers borrowed money from him for tiles. Landscapers bought shrubs and lawn with loans from Ben. Dry cleaners turned to him for loans when their equipment needed repairs. The business grew slowly, and there were setbacks along the way, but after 4 years of operation, the new bank began to generate a small but steady income. Ben was still working as before, but he now felt confident enough to buy his own home. The one he chose was too big for one person, but he chose it because it was the house he wanted to buy for Elizabeth. His pain over the loss of his wife slowly subsided over time, but Ben still couldn't bring himself to seriously consider keeping another promise to Elizabeth. A year after her death, Ben's friends began trying to get him involved socially. Perry's wife, Frances, in particular, made it her mission to find possible replacements for him. But although Ben went on dates with very nice women, none of them aroused his interest. Finally, 4 years after Ben opened CFB, something happened that changed everything. Instead of renting an expensive office, Ben made it a practice to work in his branches. He set up his laptop in the back office of one branch for a week, then in the next branch the following week. He believed that this allowed him to remain in close contact with both employees and clients. One day he was doing calculations when a flash flashed on the wall. Ben knew it was a silent alarm set in all his branches. One of the tellers pressed a button, which meant that a robbery was now taking place at the bank. Quickly checking the security cameras, Ben spotted the would-be robber leaning against the cash register. He then switched to a general view of the hall to see if there were any accomplices. Finding no one, he switched to the external camera. The only vehicle in the parking lot was a beat-up pickup truck. Ben switched back to the camera showing the robbery and zoomed in on the image. A minute later, he made a fateful decision. As expected, the cashier quickly filled the bag with all the cash from the cash register. When she handed it to the robber, he snatched the bag and ordered her not to call the police. Then he jumped out of the door. Walking quickly across the parking lot, the man yanked open the door and climbed into the cab of his truck, only to pull back in surprise. Ben was sitting in the passenger seat. "Who the hell are you?" the man asked, stunned. "I'm Ben Mitchell. This is my bank that you are trying to rob." The man put his hand threateningly into his jacket pocket. "I don't care who you are, get out of my car or else," he shouted threateningly. "Not until you listen to me," Ben said calmly. The man stared at him in surprise, then shouted again. "I'm telling you, you better get out now before something bad happens." Ben looked at him carefully. "You don't have a weapon, do you?" The robber measured him with an angry look. Then suddenly his shoulders went limp, and he looked down at the steering wheel. "No," he said resignedly. Ben pointed to the bag of money the man was still holding. "How much were you hoping to get?" The man looked at him, his face etched with lines of fatigue. I was hoping for $30,000. I think this will be enough to catch up on the mortgage and last until I find a new job. Ben shook his head. There's less than $5,000 in this bag. This is the limit that we set for each cash register. But don't check the bag. If Rose did everything right, there is a dye bomb inside that will go off if you open it. The man looked at him in surprise, then shook his head in disgust. What kind of a robber am I? He spat. Have you ever done this before? Asked Ben. No, I'm not a criminal. I wasn't one before. But 6 months ago, I was fired from the factory. Then my wife got sick and everything went to hell. He looked at Ben with sad eyes. I think I just got desperate and stupidly decided to do it. Ben looked at him for another minute, then opened the passenger door. Come with me, he ordered. Doomed, the man got out of the truck and followed Ben back to the bank. The bank employees were shocked, to say the least, to see their boss walk through the door, followed by the man who had just tried to rob them. They were even more stunned when Ben sat down at the table and invited the robber to sit opposite him. Someone give me a loan form, Ben asked. Ben turned to his new acquaintance. So here's the deal. You will give me back the money you just tried to take. In return, I will lend you the money you need, and you will return it to me when you get back on your feet. Now the man was truly stunned. Why are you doing this? You already know I don't have a job, and besides, I just tried to rob your bank. Ben smiled as he filled out the loan form. If I call the police and report a robbery, the bank will be closed for the rest of the day, maybe longer. This is already a considerable loss, plus there will be a lot of paperwork and other difficulties. But if I lend you the money you need and you pay me back, I will make a small profit from this transaction. I consider myself a pretty good judge of character, and I think you're worth the risk. He turned the papers so that the man could see it. So, how about this? Do we have a deal? The man glanced at the document, then his eyes widened and he looked closer. Wait, that says you're lending me $40,000. You wanted $30,000. I thought you might need a little extra supply. If you don't need everything, you can always return the rest. The man looked at him in awe, took the pen Ben was offering, and signed the document. He then looked at Ben again and said, God bless you, Mr. Mitchell. God bless you. The story quickly spread throughout the bank, and by that same day Perry Burgeon was calling Ben. What were you thinking? He demanded. We'll never see that money again. Maybe, maybe not, Ben admitted, but it just felt right. Please, Ben, don't play any more guessing games without consulting me first, Perry begged. But the story didn't end there. Another bank client at this time managed to film the entire incident on video and posted it on YouTube. When Ben arrived at work the next day, he was greeted by a film crew from one of the local TV channels asking for an interview. Before he could finish with them, another reporter called, and then another. That evening, the story became the main news on the evening editions. While Ben was trying to process what was happening the next day, a friend brought him a copy of USA Today, which had picked up the story for national publication. While Ben was reading, one of his employees approached him with his eyes wide open. This is Good Morning America. They want you to fly to New York and do the show. Then the story took an even more unexpected turn. During the live broadcast, Robin Roberts shocked Ben with the news that a local employer had heard his story and offered the former bank robber a job. If Ben Mitchell was willing to give it a chance, I think we can too, a company spokesman said, and the audience erupted in applause. The New York Times published an article under a photograph of a surprised Ben Mitchell with the caption, "The Face of Compassionate Capitalism." The article also provided details about Ben's life, including the deaths of his father and Elizabeth. Ben didn't want this to happen, but there was little he could do to prevent it. The publicity gave CFB a huge boost in name recognition and an influx of new depositors and lending clients. Perry was delighted to see the weekly numbers rise. He never mentioned his initial reaction to Ben's action again. A month after the excitement died down, one of Ben's employees came to see him. "There is a woman here who wants to see you," he said. "She said she was a reporter." Ben sighed. "I thought it was all over. Can't she come at another time?" The man in front of him looked at Ben strangely. "I really think you should see her." Ben raised his eyebrows in surprise, but the man didn't say another word. Finally, Ben told him to take the reporter inside. When he heard the door open, he looked up and was simply dumbfounded. The woman standing in front of him was simply amazing. She was tall, with dark hair that flowed down and framed the most breathtaking face Ben had ever seen. She was not classically beautiful. Her nose had a slight bend, which hinted that it had once been broken. But this did not spoil her appearance in any way. On the contrary, it made her face even more expressive. With her high cheekbones and dark eyes, she was the most attractive woman Ben had ever seen in person. He suddenly realized that he had been staring at her and hurriedly stood up to shake her hand, apologizing for the modesty of his office. If a woman was dissatisfied with something, she did not show it in any way. Sitting down on a chair, she bowed her head and looked at Ben from under her long eyelashes. "My name is Scylla Devereaux, Mr. Mitchell, and in fact, it is I who owe you an apology. I'm not a news reporter, I'm an author who's writing a book about new business trends. My working version is called Metamorphoses of American Banking in the 21st Century. From what I've read in the news, Community First Bank would be a great case study." Ben was glad to talk to her and used this opportunity to learn as much as he could about the charming woman who sat in front of him. He was pleased to learn that Scylla received an MBA from the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. After several years of working for a major consulting firm, she told Ben that she became fascinated by the lessons that consulting taught her and decided to try her hand at writing a book. In turn, he briefly told her about his background and how he came to the CFB philosophy and mission. The conversation was so easy that Ben was surprised when one of the employees knocked on the door to inform them that the bank was closing for the night. "I didn't realize how much time had passed," she apologized sheepishly. "Would you like to continue the conversation over a cup of coffee or dinner?" She smiled regretfully. "I would love to, but unfortunately I already have plans for this evening." Seeing the disappointment on Ben's face, she quickly added, "Perhaps we can continue this conversation another time. I don't want to interrupt your work any more than I already have." He quickly agreed, and a new meeting was scheduled. The next time they met, the conversation went just as easily as before. Ben opened up to Scylla and talked about how he lost Elizabeth. Her story moved Scylla to tears. In turn, she told him about her first marriage to a man in Miami who became violent. "My crooked nose is a parting gift from him," she said bitterly. "I never tried to fix him. Every time I look in the mirror, I want to remember the price I had to pay for trusting." Ben told her that her nose made her face even more expressive and attractive, and she smiled gratefully. When the evening came to an end, Scylla kissed him on the cheek and told him how much she enjoyed their meetings. Since Ben felt the same way, they easily agreed to meet again. The next interview took place over dinner at one of the best restaurants in the city. By this time, Ben had stopped deceiving himself. He wanted to impress her. She was so different from the other women he was introduced to after he became a widower. She was smart and easy to talk to. She had a good sense of humor. And in addition, she had the kind of appearance and figure that you would see in fashion magazines. As he walked her to the table, he noticed the envious glances that followed them and felt proud. The dinner was even more enjoyable than their previous meetings, no doubt due to the excellent food accompanied by excellent wine. Ben didn't want the evening to end and was delighted when she asked if he could show her his house before they left for the night. "I realized that you can learn a lot about a person by seeing how they live," she said as he drove her through his neighborhood. Now he was especially glad that he had bought a big house. When they went inside, he took her coat and hung it with his in the closet in the hallway. He then led her into the living room and began to tell her about the house. Suddenly, she grabbed him by the shoulder, spun him around, and kissed him passionately while pressing her body against his. After a long, blissful moment, she pulled away. "I'm sorry, Ben," she said, breathing heavily. I know I shouldn't have done this, but you are the most amazing person I've ever met." He looked at her in amazement, not daring to believe that she had the same feelings for him. Then determination appeared in his eyes, mixed with years of suppressed desire, and he pulled her towards him and kissed her hungrily. After a minute or two, he stopped to look at her. "I feel the same way, Scylla. I haven't been able to get you out of my head since the day I met you." He wanted to hug her even tighter, but she stopped him. "No, you, dear man, let me do this." She pushed him back to sit on the sofa. Then, swaying her hips to music that only she could hear, she began to take off her clothes. She froze in her pose for a moment, and then stepped forward and began to impatiently pull off his clothes. He then bent down, picked her up, and carried her back to his bedroom. When he opened his eyes again, morning light was streaming into the bedroom through the windows. He glanced at Scylla, who was lying on her side, still sleeping, only partially covered by the sheet. Ben shook his head in surprise. Even in her sleep, she looked carefully chosen. He noticed her eyes open, and she was looking at him with a slight grin on her face. "Hello, love," she said quietly. "Thank you for a wonderful evening." He pulled her towards him and kissed her softly on the lips. "Last night may have been the most incredible experience of my life," he told her sincerely. "Did you like it?" she asked flirtatiously. "It was very strong," he said with pointed seriousness. Her face became serious. "That's exactly how I feel about you, intensely." From then on, there was no longer any appearance that they remained author and interviewee. They were now a couple. Ben began taking Scylla everywhere, introducing her to his friends, showing her the sights of his city. Ben's friends were glad to see him come out of his long period of mourning. After an evening at the theater with Perry and his wife Frances, when the two women went to powder their noses, Perry pulled Ben aside. "You're lucky, damn it!" he exclaimed, slapping Ben on the back. "I thought you'd given up on women forever, but damn, you sure have made up for lost time." Ben had noticed how much Frances had let herself go over the last few years, and thought that was why he heard a note of envy in his partner's voice. Ben was also surprised by the reactions of some of the women he knew. Although they were the ones who most wanted Ben to return to the dating world, some of them now seemed almost unhappy that he had found someone. He chalked it up to jealousy. "They wanted me to succeed, but not to that extent," he thought with a smile. After 6 months of living together, Ben decided that he had lived alone long enough. When he proposed to Scylla, she happily agreed. Ben invited her to have any wedding she wanted, but she firmly said she wanted a simple ceremony in their garden with only Perry and Frances present as witnesses. Ben's thoughts were suddenly interrupted by laughter in the audience, and he realized that Perry was finishing his introduction. Ben looked at his smiling wife and allowed himself a feeling of deep satisfaction. "Life is damn good," he thought. "After everything I've been through, it means something when the biggest problem I have is how to say no to a buyout offer from Bank Group." "And now," he heard Perry say, "without further ado, I present to you Banker of the Year, Ben Mitchell." As a wave of applause swept through the hall, Ben leaned over and kissed Scylla, then stood up and reached for the speech, which he stuffed into the inside pocket of his jacket. At that moment, he was surprised to notice that he was sweating. "I'm usually not that nervous before a performance," he thought as he walked to the podium. A wave of heat washed over him, and he thought, "I should ask them to turn up the air conditioning." Having laid out his notes on the podium, he looked around the hall and froze. His heart was pounding so hard in his chest that he wondered if the audience could hear it. Then a familiar metallic taste filled his mouth, and a line from an old Rem song popped into his head. "Aluminum tastes like fear." Ben turned to look at Perry for help, but recoiled when he saw his friend's face illuminated in rainbow colors. Ben rubbed his eyes, but the colors did not disappear, but became even brighter. He grabbed the podium to keep his balance, and the taste of chocolate mixed with aluminum. In a panic, he tried to ask for help, but his tongue and lips moved so slowly that the sound that came out of his mouth was like a drunken growl. He heard screams and tried to see where they were coming from, but his vision became blurry and blurry. Suddenly, he could make out hands and arms reaching towards him, and the audience turned into zombies bent on killing him. He let out a high-pitched groan and tried to hide behind the podium, but it seemed like a living creature, trembling and pulsating in his hands. He watched in horror as the microphone turned into a snake, which opened its mouth to reveal fangs dripping with venom. In fear and disgust, he pushed the thing away from him, and the stand crashed to the floor, emitting a purple echo. Screams and screams filled the air, and when Ben looked up to see what was happening, he saw that the walls of the hall began to melt and drain. Before he could react, a spark of light flashed on the ceiling, and the crystals of the chandeliers turned into ice, spears flying straight towards him. In a panic, he climbed over the table in front of him and rolled off the podium onto the floor. The fall stunned him for a moment, but then he saw the figures approaching and crawled under the catwalk, trying to find cover. The darkness helped him calm down for a moment, but then luminous spots appeared, taking on strange shapes that were constantly changing. Some of them were quite beautiful, and he froze, admiring what he saw. But then he was pulled back into the light, and despite his desperate attempts to free himself, he was unable to escape. Heavy weights crushed his arms and legs, and something squeezed his head, preventing him from moving. The noise around him was deafening, and he tried to drown it out with his own screams, but to no avail. Suddenly, additional pressure was placed on his knee, and a sharp pain shot through his right thigh. The world began to fade into darkness, and the last thing he saw was Scylla's blurry face leaning over him. Then there was nothing left. When Gina Esposito arrived at the hospital Monday morning, she found a note instructing her to meet with her boss. A feeling of fear flashed through her. The hospital had already gone through one wave of layoffs, and rumors spoke of impending new layoffs. But when she found her boss, she was relieved to find out that she was not being fired. However, this relief quickly turned to disappointment when she learned that she had been assigned a special task. Starting today, you have a new patient. He is a VIP, and Dr. Adenauer will personally treat him, so you need to be on your guard. Gina tried not to roll her eyes as she accepted the file on her new patient. That's all I needed, wiping some rich old man's ass under the supervision of the head doctor, she thought with disgust. But then she reminded herself that she was lucky to still have a job, and she felt ashamed of her attitude. This happened to her often. In fact, she thought, this has been going on ever since that bastard left me. The then-boyfriend managed to make her a child, despite the fact that she was taking birth control pills. When he found out, he forgot about his promise to marry her and instantly disappeared. Pregnant and unable to pay the rent on her own, Gina was forced to move back in with her mother. Still, she reminded herself, if I hadn't gotten pregnant, I wouldn't have Angela now. The thought of her little girl always lifted her spirits, and she cheerfully set out on her new assignment with her usual cheerfulness. Walking down the hallway, she looked at the new patient's chart. Well, I was wrong about Alzheimer's, she thought. Apparently her patient, Benjamin Mitchell, was a 36-year-old white man, otherwise healthy, who suddenly suffered a mental health crisis on Saturday evening. She flipped through a few pages. Wow, they didn't spare that poor guy, she muttered. He had a CT scan, PET scan, MRI scan, and a full physical exam. All results were normal. Great, she thought. I wonder what I should do with it. She found him in the so-called rubber room. Of course, it wasn't real rubber, it was basically plastic covered in foam, but that's what everyone in the hospital called this room. He must have caused a huge scandal, she thought, looking through the observation window at the comatose figure. She turned to the night nurse, who was getting ready for her shift. What was he like? Asked Gina. He was sedated with diazepam during his psychotic episode, and he remained on it while the examinations were carried out. After they were completed, he was transferred here, and he slept the entire time. I would imagine that once his system is cleared, he will be given clozapine, and then we'll see what happens. Gina nodded. Who's on duty, Ed or Harold? The nurse immediately understood what was going on. Harold today, if you need him. Gina nodded again. Both of these large orderlies could handle the most violent patient, but she preferred Harold. He was a gentle giant. Ed always seemed to be looking for an opportunity to inflict pain if the patient showed even the slightest resistance. She looked out the viewing window again. To her surprise, the patient was now sitting with his back against the wall. He didn't seem aggressive, so Gina decided to take a chance. "Call Harold," she asked the woman. "I'll go see how our boy is doing. He doesn't look dangerous, but it could use some help." When she quietly opened the door and entered, the patient quickly raised his head, but did not move. However, Gina chose to remain on the opposite side of the room. When she made no further movement, he looked at her in confusion. "Who are you?" "I'm Nurse Esposito," she replied, "and you must be Mr. Mitchell. Is there anything I can help you with?" She watched him carefully, curiously waiting to see what would be his first priority. He surprised her. "Yes, you can. Please bring me a cup of coffee." She thought for a moment and then decided that a little caffeine wouldn't hurt. She turned to the grate in the wall and said, "Harold, could you get a cup of coffee for Mr. Mitchell?" Then she turned back to Ben. "Cream and sugar." "Only sugar, 2 packets." When she handed him the cardboard glass, he took a quick sip and then winced. "It's terrible," he said. She laughed. "Try drinking this every day," she answered. "I have to." He smiled slightly, and she thought it was a positive sign. She also noticed that he had not stopped drinking coffee. When he finished his glass, he suddenly asked, "Where am I?" She had been expecting this question and decided to answer directly. "You are in the Longview Mental Hospital, Mr. Mitchell. Apparently, you had a nervous breakdown on Saturday night and were brought here for observation and treatment." He looked at her with a strange look. "I remember the banquet, but after that I must have fallen asleep because I had terrible nightmares. At least I thought they were nightmares." His face became confused, and he suddenly asked, "What day is it today?" "Today is Monday," she said quietly, waiting for his reaction. "Weekday," he exclaimed. "Have I really been in this state for so long? What's happening to me?" Before Gina could respond, there was a noise outside the door and Dr. Bernard Adenauer, Longview's chief executive officer and chief medical officer, entered the room. The great man himself, she thought sarcastically. "I'll answer that question, nurse," Dr. Adenauer said, and Gina quickly stepped aside. The doctor walked up and seriously shook his patient's hand. "Do you remember me, Ben?" Ben looked at him carefully, and it dawned on him. "I think we've met before. Oh yes, you're Dr. Adenauer. You're the head of Longview." The psychiatrist beamed at Ben like an elementary school teacher beamed at a bright student. "Great, Ben. That means your memory is intact. That's a very good sign." Gina started taking notes on her tablet. Ben repeated his question. "Dr. Adenauer, can you tell me what's wrong with me?" "Well, Ben, we're not ready to make a definitive diagnosis yet, but we've learned quite a lot already. If you don't remember, you had a severe psychotic episode at a banquet that, ironically, was dedicated to you." He chuckled slightly. "You seem to have scared a lot of people with your behavior." Ben groaned and hung his head in embarrassment. Gina snorted to herself. "What sensitivity this doctor has," she thought. Dr. Adenauer was not concerned. "When I heard about your episode and watched the video." Ben moaned again. "They have it on video." Adenauer nodded and continued without stopping. "My first thought was that you have a glioma, a brain tumor. Pressure on the brain could explain this irrational behavior." As Ben's face paled, Gina decided that her initial assessment of Dr. Adenauer's demeanor had been too soft. "Fortunately," the great doctor continued, "we were able to rule out this possibility. Likewise, we ruled out stroke, seizures, high blood sugar, and virtually every other physical abnormality that could cause such a case. You will be glad to know that you are a very healthy young man." "Except that I'm losing my mind," Ben said bitterly. "We are not yet ready to confirm this," Adenauer replied. "You only had one irregular incident, nothing more. If it does not recur, we will conclude that it was an isolated incident of unknown origin. If it recurs, We can evaluate what treatment may bring relief." Ben looked at him suspiciously. "Do I need to stay here?" "Oh yes, I think that would be wise. Firstly, your stay here will make it easier to interact with me and other staff, such as Nurse Esposito, as well as monitor you. Secondly, if there should be a relapse, you will be in a safe place." Ben grimaced. "For how long?" "We'll see about that," the doctor said carefree. "Well, I have to go, but I'll see you later to start therapy." He turned to Gina. "Nurse Esposito, please come to me." When they left the rubber room, Dr. Adenauer turned sharply to the nurse. "Mr. Mitchell is a very important patient, Miss Esposito. It will be your responsibility to devote all your time to him." "All the time?" Gina gasped. "What about my other patients?" Adenauer frowned impatiently. "Your other patients will be reassigned. You will be required to keep him company, interact with him, and continually assess his mental state. I want you to closely monitor him for any signs of relapse. Keep detailed records of his thoughts and actions, and pay special attention to look for any signs of irrationality. Document everything." "Got it." "I think so, doctor, but I've never done anything like this before, and—" "Are you saying that you are incapable of performing these duties, Nurse Esposito? Do you want me to find someone else to take your place?" "Oh, no, sir, I can handle it, I assure you," she said hastily. "That's good," he said. "This looks like a fairly unusual case, and I want to make sure we carefully monitor and record his course." "Yes, doctor, I understand. You can rely on me." As the majestic figure of the chief medical officer walked away, Gina rolled her eyes and shook her head. "Holy heavens, what was that? I thought he was going to fire me on the spot." Taking a deep breath, she returned to the rubber room and quietly went inside. Mitchell looked at her with irritation. "So you will be my babysitter." In her notebook, Gina wrote, "Patient exhibits initial hostility." She mentally sighed, "This won't be a fun mission." That evening at dinner, Gina told her mother and brother about her new assignment. Her brother was a detective in the city police. Since his marriage ended, Marco had gotten used to going to his mother's for dinner once or twice a week. Gina called him a freeloader, but was secretly glad of his company. She always adored her older brother as a child and enjoyed his company, even if he liked to tease her. She was complaining about her new assignment when Marco interrupted her. "What's your new patient's name?" he asked. "You know I shouldn't talk about our patients," she replied. He rolled his eyes. "It's not like I'm going to announce his name on Twitter," he said with annoyance. Realizing that she wasn't going to talk, he continued. "Okay, you said this guy went crazy at the banquet last weekend. Well, look at this." With that, he took out his iPad and connected to YouTube. Seconds later, Gina and her mother were watching a video apparently taken from the floor of a hotel room. Ben Mitchell walks up to the podium to accept the Banker of the Year award and completely breaks down in front of hundreds of guests. While Gina looked on in surprise, her mother began to get very nervous. "Is it safe for you to work with this person?" she asked anxiously. Gina reassured her that she was completely safe. However, she was amazed at how quickly Ben changed from a normal, seemingly happy man to a madman. "And what does your chief psychiatrist say about what's wrong with this guy?" Marco asked with a grin. "Dr. Adenauer hasn't made a diagnosis yet," Gina said sternly, angry at her brother's teasing. "Well, I can tell what's wrong with him, and I'm not even a rich doctor. Your guy is definitely on something. I've seen it on the streets many times," Marco stated confidently. Gina gave him a dark look. "Well, you're wrong, smart guy. First of all, they gave him a full physical examination. He's clean. In fact, they say he doesn't drink at all. Anyway, they examined his arms and legs thoroughly, and 200 people at the banquet ate the same food as him, and no one got hurt. So do your police work and leave the medical diagnosis to the professionals." Marco was undaunted. "You might be right, but he definitely looked like an addict." He shook his head. "Anyway, it's a shame this happened to him. From what I've heard, he's a pretty good person for a banker." Both women were interested, so Marco found a video of Mitchell giving a loan to an unlucky bank robber. When they finished viewing, Marco added, "I thought this guy was crazy when I heard about this trick. If someone is trying to rob a bank, you can't just let him go." But apparently it worked this time. It just goes to show that for every rule has an exception. Gina didn't say anything, but she was impressed by the last video she saw. She decided to soften her stance towards Ben Mitchell a little when she saw him the next day. Gina had never received an assignment like the current one before, and she was not sure what Adenauer wanted from her. How was the nurse supposed to know anything about Ben's mental state? Moreover, how was she going to spend so much time with a patient without running out of things to talk about? And how could she achieve anything positive given his depressed and somewhat hostile state? The next morning, Gina walked into Ben's room with a sense of purpose. He greeted her with sarcasm. "Ah, my nanny is back." Gina was not embarrassed. "That's not a very nice way to say hello, especially since I tried to be nice to you." With that, she showed the Starbucks cup she had brought with her and handed it to him. His demeanor instantly changed, and he accepted the glass gratefully. His smile grew even wider as she handed him a few packets of sugar. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "You have no idea how much I missed good coffee." After a few minutes, he raised his head and looked at Gina with a grin. "Okay, Nurse Esposito, I guess I owe you a little cooperation. So what's on the agenda today? Word associations, Rorschach tests, block puzzles." Gina rolled her eyes, but she had a plan, so she ignored his teasing. After much thought, she decided to start by examining Ben's memories of what happened just before his episode. She was interested in knowing in great detail everything that happened before the attack began, his emotions, actions, and interactions with others. While asking her questions, she did not notice anything unusual or noteworthy. However, she continued the interrogation so as not to miss anything important. When she thought she had exhausted the subject, she gently insisted that he describe the episode itself. As she expected, he was reluctant to do so, but she explained that the details of his experience might be helpful to Dr. Adenauer in making a diagnosis. As Gina listened to him recount his experience, she found it difficult to maintain professional composure. Most of the mentally ill she encountered did not realize that anything unusual was happening to them. The voices they heard or the impulses they felt were natural to them. But Ben's experience was different. He seemed to be fully aware of how abnormal his behavior was. Gina could easily see how frightened he was that his mind was failing. What bothered him most was the distorted perception. "I remember seeing a woman screaming, but instead of hearing her voice, I felt a strong, bad taste in my mouth. At another point, I ran my hand across the carpet and saw a blue color. It was the most scary and disturbing experience of my life." "What you were experiencing is called synesthesia," Gina explained. "Essentially, your senses are confused and your brain has misinterpreted the sensations. Synesthesia is often observed, but it is not clear exactly what is happening." Ben was still disturbed by his memories of the experience, but he was somewhat reassured by the fact that it had a name. It was clear that Ben didn't want to go too far into his episode. Gina didn't want to risk provoking another one, so she suggested they have lunch early. As the two of them ate tasteless food off paper plates, she racked her brain, trying to find a safe topic to discuss with him. Shifting thoughts, she remembered Dr. Adenauer's comment about Ben's memory. Perhaps this was the approach she should have taken. Plus, maybe it will help her gain Ben's trust. "Okay," Gina said cheerfully as they finished lunch, "let's change the subject. This afternoon will be all about Ben Mitchell. I want to know everything about you." "I think you're going to have a boring time," Ben replied. "Let me be the judge of that," she replied. "Well, let's begin." With that, she began a tour of Ben's life, asking him questions about everything he could remember: his relationship with his parents, his likes and dislikes, his emotions and preferences, basically everything that might shed light or reveal the antecedents of his sudden psychosis. Before starting, Gina was afraid that they might quickly run out of topics to discuss. But once they started, time flew by, each event bringing up new questions and memories. Gina wasn't as interested in the actual events of Ben's life. She looked for subtext, any clues that might reveal the mind of the patient before her. But it was impossible to listen to his story and not be drawn into it. Gradually, she began to draw conclusions about the person and not just about the patient. Before Gina started working with Ben, she had certain stereotypes about businessmen in general and bankers in particular. But it quickly became clear that this one did not live up to her expectations. For example, he did not come from a privileged family. His father was a middle manager, and she soon learned that Ben's mother was drinking away any extra money they might have. Listening to Ben talk about his mother, she quickly understood why he avoided alcohol so carefully. Even if he had some genetic predisposition to alcoholism, Gina decided that the spectacle of his mother's degradation had left such an indelible mark that he would never give in to temptation. But beyond the life lessons he learned, Gina also noticed the impact of her mother's illness on Ben. It would be easier if she died suddenly, she thought. Yet rather than withdrawing or becoming bitter, Ben's response was to become even closer to his father, and Gina decided that this showed a significant level of resilience, which she appreciated. Ben was just about to talk about Elizabeth when they were interrupted by the nurse on the 4 o'clock to midnight shift. "Sorry to interrupt you, Gina, but if you don't stop, we won't be able to do the shift review and handover." Gina was stunned and, promising Ben that they would start tomorrow morning, she hurried away. Later, as she picked up her car from the hospital parking lot and headed home, she shook her head. "I need to manage my time better," she thought sadly. "I have a lot of notes to type when I get home." The next morning, Gina brought another Starbucks cup for Ben, and he gratefully acknowledged her thoughtfulness. It seemed to her that he was glad to see not only the gift, but also herself, and this encouraged her. Despite how much time she spent with Ben discussing his early life, Gina found many more issues she wanted to discuss as she looked through her notes. In the end, it was only after dinner that they returned to the topic of Elizabeth. Gina knew that Ben had been married previously, but did not know any details about their relationship or why it ended. Despite her professional reserves, Ben's story touched her more than she expected. So when Ed came to take Ben to his session with Dr. Adenauer, she almost breathed a sigh of relief. As soon as he left, she blew her nose and dried her eyes, cursing herself for becoming emotionally involved in the fate of one of her patients. The next morning, after Ben had enjoyed his coffee, he asked her an unexpected question. "What do you think of Dr. Adenauer?" "Well, he's a famous psychiatrist and has been very successful," she said, not wanting to express her personal feelings about his aloof manner and dictatorial approach to the hospital staff. "Why do you ask?" "It just seems like he was being formal with me," Ben complained. "He seemed distracted and continued to ask me questions that we had already discussed. Besides, I don't see how Freudian analysis can help in a case like mine. I'm not a doctor, much less a psychiatrist, so I can't judge Dr. Adenauer's methods," Gina answered evasively. "But he's very well respected, and I'm sure he knows what he's doing." Ben nodded and took another sip of his coffee, but it was obvious he wasn't convinced by her answer. Then he struck her again. "Before we continue talking about me, I want to know something about you. You've asked all the questions so far, so it's only fair to give me a turn," he said. "No, that's inappropriate. You're the patient, and I'm the nurse. You're the one being treated, not me." He visibly winced at her last words, and Gina immediately felt guilty. There was an awkward pause, but he recovered faster than she did. "I'm just not used to such attention. Besides, I would really like to know something about you. After all, you were practically my only companion for quite a long time." She again wanted to refuse him, but then thought about it. Maybe, she thought, I could learn something from the questions he asks, from the things he's interested in. Besides, I don't know what I'm doing anyway, so why not? She ended up spending most of the day telling Ben her story. At first, his questions were the kind that might be asked on a new acquaintance, but soon he began to become interested in her thoughts and motives, asking questions not only about facts, but also about feelings. Damn, she thought, he's better at this than I am. He was particularly interested in her relationship with her ex-boyfriend and was outraged to learn how the man abandoned her when she became pregnant. While describing this episode, Gina felt how long suppressed emotions were rising to the surface. "It's not like I was trying to get pregnant," she exclaimed angrily. "We used contraception, that's what happened. But he accused me of trying to catch him, and then he just disappeared." "Have you thought about abortion or adoption?" asked Ben. "No way," Gina answered sharply. "Angela's father may have been a rat, but my daughter is the best thing that happened in my life. It wasn't easy raising her alone, but I wouldn't change a thing," she said decisively. "I wish my mother felt the same way about me," Ben said thoughtfully. At that moment, a noise was heard outside the door of the room, and when Gina looked back, she saw one of the most amazing women she had ever seen entering the room. "Scylla," Ben exclaimed and jumped to his feet. The woman's face immediately showed confusion, and Gina instantly understood what was happening. She grabbed Ben's arm and pulled it. "Sit down, Ben," she said hurriedly. "You'll scare her." Understanding dawned on Ben's face, and he reluctantly sat back down. Seeing his calm actions, the woman entered the room. "Ben, darling, I'm so glad to see you," she exclaimed. Gina thought it sounded disingenuous, but she realized that people could react this way to mental illness. Ben beamed at the sight of his wife. "It's so good to see you, honey. I missed you so much." Scylla smiled and then quickly glanced at Gina. "Who is this woman?" she asked. Gina turned to her. "I am Esposito's nurse, Mrs. Mitchell. Dr. Adenauer has assigned me to work with your husband to restore him." Ben's wife gave her a reserved nod, then added, "I see. Well, I guess we won't need your presence at the moment." Gina didn't allow herself to be scared. "A hospital staff member is required to be with the patient on this floor at all times," she said firmly. "You should have been told this at the counter." "It's okay," Ben quickly intervened. "She's my friend. She helps me a lot." "I see," Scylla repeated. Apparently deciding not to make a scene, she turned back to Ben. "Honey, I'm so sorry I couldn't visit you sooner. I knew you were in good hands, and after your, accident at the banquet, everything was in such a state of turmoil. Anyway, I worked a lot with Perry to keep everything going. Took its course in the bank. It was really crazy there, as you can imagine." Gina flinched at her choice of words, but Scylla continued. "Anyway, Dr. Adenauer has kept me informed of your condition, and I am very glad. He says you are making excellent progress." Gina saw the skepticism in Ben's eyes when Dr. Adenauer was mentioned, but knew better than to say anything. As they talked, it was clear that Ben was happy to see Scylla, but Gina also sensed a hint of disappointment. "I'm glad to know that you and Perry are keeping things going at the bank," he told her. "That's really comforting. Hopefully I can get back to work soon." He paused, then added, "It's a pity you couldn't come sooner." "I know, honey, and I'm so sorry. But here, I brought you a little gift to make it up to me." With these words, she picked up the brown bag she had brought with her and handed it to her husband. When Ben opened it, he found a Starbucks cup and 2 packets of sugar. "I know how much you must have missed your favorite coffee, so I brought you some." With that, she stood up to peck him on the cheek, and before he could react, she quickly moved away. "Sorry, I have to run, darling, but it was wonderful to see you, and I'll be back as soon as I can." With that, Scylla turned around and ran out the door, leaving Ben with a cup of coffee and sugar in his hands and a puzzled expression on his face. Before the moment could get awkward, Gina quickly spoke. "Oh, it's so nice of her to bring you your favorite coffee. She must love you very much." Ben nodded and smiled slightly, but Gina noticed how he looked at the empty Starbucks cup she brought him that morning. Still trying to cheer him up, she added, "Your wife is stunningly beautiful. I can see why you married her." "Thanks," Ben muttered and sat down to drink his coffee. It was obvious that he was upset by his wife's hasty departure. At that moment, a nurse from the evening shift poked her head in the door. informing Gina that it was time to change shifts. Gina patted Ben's arm and said as cheerfully as possible, "See you in the morning. Enjoy your coffee." As she drove home that evening, Gina was seething with anger. What a bitch, she thought. If Ben were my husband, I'd be banging on the hospital doors every day to get to him, and she ran away in 5 minutes. Gina was so indignant that she told everything to her mother and brother Marco, who came to them for dinner. What's wrong with this woman? She was indignant. Marco immediately started making fun of his sister, claiming that she was too attached to her patient. When he started singing a tease about lovers kissing on a tree, Gina couldn't stand it. You should listen to yourself for once, Marco. You sound like you're back in high school. You don't know a single detail about the situation. This guy went through a terrible experience and his wife treated him like trash. Anyone would be outraged by that, so keep your opinions to yourself. Marco knew his sister well enough not to make things worse, but he couldn't help the grin on his face. Gina rolled her eyes and tried to ignore him for the rest of the evening. I don't get too close to my patient, she told herself firmly after he left. However, the next morning she went to work earlier than usual. After purchasing a Starbucks cup for Ben from a kiosk in the hospital lobby, she hurried to the floor. But before she went in, the night nurse stopped her. You better not go in there, she warned. He had another attack last night, and this time it was serious. Oh my God, Gina cried and rushed to look through the viewing window. Ben was tied up in a straitjacket and leaned against the corner of the room. Holding back her emotions, she returned to the night nurse. Tell me what happened, she said, trying to remain calm. Apparently, the attack began immediately after the change of duty personnel, the nurse answered. The night nurse heard him scream and noticed that he was sweating a lot. Then he began to become delirious and rushed around the room. The nurse said that it seemed as if he was going blind. He kept running into the walls and falling. He would hide in a corner and sit there as if in fear, and then suddenly he got up again and began to feel the walls like a blind man. Thankfully, Harold wasn't gone yet, and he and Ed were able to calm him down and put him in a straitjacket. We gave him a high dose of diazepam, and that calmed him down. But this morning he started moaning and crying again. Gina was deeply shocked by what happened, but tried not to show it. She returned to the viewing window and looked closely at Ben. He seemed awake, but completely depressed. Gina opened the door and walked up to Ben. Sitting down next to him, she began to loosen the straitjacket. Are you sure you know what you're doing? Another nurse asked worriedly. He was pretty wild last night. I'm sure, Gina said, although she wasn't really sure what to expect. But she acted decisively until she finally freed him from the heavy material. She then sat down next to him and put her arm around his shoulders. He looked at her with frightened eyes. Oh, Gina, I don't know what's happening to me, he whispered in a hoarse voice. He then lowered his head into her lap and began to cry like a child. Most of Gina's patients did not realize they were sick. On the contrary, they insisted that everything was fine with them and that the rest were crazy. This was the first time she had encountered a patient who seemed to fully understand that something was wrong with his mind, and this realization shook him to the core. Seeing him in this state touched Gina more than any other patient, and she herself could not hold back her tears. She stayed with him for a long time until another nurse entered the room. When Gina raised her eyebrows, asking what was going on, the nurse held up a syringe. Clozapine, she said, is Dr. Adenauer's order. Gina nodded. Clozapine was the atypical antipsychotic and the drug of choice in such cases. After Ben's second episode, it became clear that he needed drug therapy. Ben, she said quietly, the nurse is about to give you an injection that should help. He raised his head for a moment, then nodded indifferently. It broke her heart that all his energy was gone. After administering the medicine, Ben quickly fell asleep. Gina quietly left the room, then stood in the hallway, trying to regain her composure. She was deeply upset that Ben had a second attack. He seemed so normal, so well-behaved, that she dared to hope that what happened at the banquet was a one-time event. Then she remembered Scylla's words about Ben's progress, which Dr. Adenauer had supposedly noted. I would like to hear what Adenauer has to say now, she thought angrily. She walked over to the computer terminal and quickly brought up Ben's records so she could take a look for herself. What she saw shocked her. Dr. Adenauer wrote, "The patient appears to be suffering from an acute transient psychotic disorder." Under this entry, she found a second one from the previous night, which changed the diagnosis to persistent delusional disorder with chronic primary hallucinatory psychosis. She had to look up the term in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and when she found it, she was overcome with anxiety. According to recent studies, even the most modern pharmacological drugs could not completely eliminate psychotic delusions, but only weaken them. Adenauer must have been feeding Scylla Mitchell false promises to keep her from worrying, Gina decided. However, this was not her responsibility. This thought made her check the call logs, and she found no evidence that anyone had called Ben's wife with an update. This was also not part of her duties, but Gina still decided to call. She felt that Ben needed something to cheer him up, and it was obvious that he wanted to see his wife. Perhaps she will come if she finds out what happened. Hoping it wouldn't come back to haunt her, Gina picked up the phone and dialed the number listed in Ben's emergency contacts. When her call was answered, she immediately recognized the woman's deep voice. "Mrs. Mitchell, this is Nurse Esposito from the hospital. I don't want to scare you, but last night your husband had his second major psychotic episode. I thought you should know about it." "Oh, how terrible!" exclaimed the voice. "How is he now?" "We had to sedate him overnight, Mrs. Mitchell, but he woke up this morning and seemed to be feeling relatively fine. Dr. Adenauer gave him extra medication, and he's asleep now. I'd guess he'll wake up around noon if you'd like to come and visit him." "Unfortunately, I won't be able to come to the hospital today, but as soon as my work permits, I will definitely come," Scylla said coldly. Gina tried not to explode in anger at the woman's attitude. "Mrs. Mitchell, I really think it would be helpful for your husband if he could see you as soon as possible," she said. Now the voice became icy. "I'll come as soon as my work permits. Thanks for calling." And with these words, she hung up. Gina stood there, seething with anger. What kind of wife is this? She thought furiously. She was still angry when she got home that evening, and after dinner she called his brother, who did not come to dinner with them this time. "Hey, Marco, I want to ask you a favor. I want you to do a background check on Mrs. Benjamin Mitchell." She introduces herself as Scylla. Hey, sis, I can't just test someone without a good reason," Marco countered. "Well, I have a good reason," Gina responded heatedly and described her 2 encounters with her patient's wife. "She may be a cold bitch, but that doesn't mean I can just test her," Marco said when Gina finished. "Look, I know you checked on your ex and no one found out. Just do the same to her and let me know what you find. You'll get me into trouble one day, Gina, but I'll see what I can do." Gina had heard nothing new from her brother by the time she returned to work 2 days later. She checked the list of patients and, not surprised, found that no one had come to see Ben during this time. When she came to him, he was calm, but lethargic. "My brain feels like it's full of molasses," he complained. "All my thoughts seem to be slowed down." She nodded reassuringly. "This is a known side effect of clozapine," she told him. "It usually goes away quickly after you stop taking the medicine." "When will this be?" he asked hopefully. Gina realized that she had made a mistake, but tried to hide it. "Dr. Adenauer will decide that," she said. She expected him to be indignant, but he seemed to have lost interest. "It doesn't matter anyway," he said grimly. "I don't want to think if I keep going crazy." The last thing Gina wanted right now was for Ben to become depressed. In desperation, she tried to think of some neutral topic that might interest him. Suddenly, an idea came to her mind. "Tell me about banking," she said sharply. "I know you got into this because your father was a banker, but there must be something else that keeps you in this field." He looked at her suspiciously. "Why are you suddenly interested in this?" She was already involved. "It's not that I'm that interested in banking. I just want to understand why you're so interested in it." He shrugged and began to tell a story about a Christmas trip with his father many years ago. At first, he simply recounted the event and conversation in a neutral tone. But as he continued, Gina noticed passion awakening in him. She asked him clarifying questions and heard a note of enthusiasm. When he continued, Gina was delighted. Not only was he emerging from depression, but his speech and thoughts seemed to become increasingly sharper. At the same time, to her surprise, she herself began to get carried away by his story. Who would have thought that such a boring profession could have such a big impact on people's lives? Their conversation continued through lunch and throughout the day. Gina was about to ask Ben a question when there was a noise at the door. Scylla Mitchell entered, accompanied by a man in a business suit. Gina had already formed her opinion of Ben's wife and was no more impressed with her companion. The man was about the same age as Ben, but overweight and with thinning hair. Who is he and why is Scylla Mitchell with him? She thought. Ben stood up as if he wanted to run to Scylla, but perhaps remembering Gina's warning, he restrained himself. "Darling, how glad I am to see you," he exclaimed. He then turned to the man next to her. "Perry, thanks for coming. How are you?" he asked with excitement. "Gina, this is my business partner, Perry Burgeon." He enthusiastically began to ask the man about the bank, but Scylla interrupted him. "We can discuss this later, dear," she said. "Now there is something we need to discuss with you. As you can imagine, the CFB has a backlog of cases requiring enforcement decisions. We put it off for as long as we could, hoping you could return to CEO duties. But now, with the latest complication, it looks like that won't happen anytime soon." Gina wasn't sure where this conversation was going, but one look at Ben's face was enough to tell that he didn't like it. Perry continued the topic. "That's right, Ben. We have a lot of things to do. We need to file reports with the Securities and Exchange Commission, sign contracts, deal with the proposal from Bank Group, which we have not yet considered." "Wait a minute," Ben interrupted. "We've already decided that we'll reject Bank Group's offer." Of course," Perry continued quickly, "but we haven't made it official yet, and they're waiting to hear back from the CEO. "What Perry is trying to say," Scylla chimed in, "is that the bank was starting to sink without the CEO at the helm, so he took over the role until you got better. And to make sure our interests were protected, he asked me to serve as executive vice president." Ben was stunned. "But how could he do this? I am the CEO and largest shareholder. You can't just suspend me." "Of course not, dear. Nobody is going to remove you. We just received power of attorney from Judge Gray to manage your affairs, dear, until you get better. It was the only way for everything to continue to run smoothly while you were here and fighting the disease." "Have you declared me incompetent?" Ben asked in disbelief. "Trust me, this was the only way, dear," Scylla said smoothly. "Besides, this is only until you recover. Then everything will return to normal." To Gina, it was as if all the air had been let out of Ben. He seemed to shrink and leaned against the wall behind him, bowing his head. "If this is the only way, I understand. It's just not easy to accept, you know." Gina wanted to go to him and console him in his obvious distress, but out of the corner of her eye she noticed the second shift nurse giving her a signal. Reluctantly, she said, "Ben, I have to go. I'll see you in the morning, okay?" Of course," he said blankly. Perry spoke up. "I think it's time for us to go too, Scylla. We don't want to interfere with the work of the hospital." As Gina finished her notes for the shift, she watched them leave, talking to each other in quiet voices. She ground her teeth in anger. Even if what they did was necessary, there must have been a better way to present it, she thought. When she finished, she walked towards the stairs leading to the parking lot. Walking through the shadows, she suddenly heard arguing voices and froze in place. The hospital was in a safe area, and she had never had any problems, but Gina knew that a woman who was alone should always be especially careful. Not here. She heard the woman whisper and immediately recognized Scylla's voice. Intrigued, Gina cautiously moved closer, trying to see what was happening. Come on, Scylla, it's over now. Ben's out, and we're in control. There's no need to hide anymore. Oh damn, that's Perry Burgeon's voice, Gina thought. What the hell is going on? Perry, it won't help us if anyone finds out before this is over. If you'll just restrain yourself long enough to get home now, I'll show you why patience is a virtue. Gina didn't hear the man's answer because the engine of his car suddenly started running. Then, while she was hiding behind a column, the car rushed along the ramp towards the street. Oh my God, Gina thought as she headed home. Scylla and Perry having an affair. This bitch, you can expect anything from her. She found her brother helping their mother prepare dinner, and Gina pounced on him. Quickly, tell me, have you found out anything about Scylla Mitchell? Marco looked sly. You know, Gina, I really looked into Scylla Mitchell, and I have you to thank for that. Why? What did you find out? His sly look gave way to a wide smile. I found out she's the hottest, the most beautiful woman I've seen in a long time, he chuckled. It was definitely a pleasure checking her out. Gina was not happy. Idiot, she shouted angrily. I want to know what she's really like. I think she's having an affair with Ben's partner, and they're up to no good. Marco's smile turned into a knowing look. Well, it would fit her image. What do you mean? Gina demanded. Based on the information received, she was indeed married to a guy in Miami, just like she told Ben. And here's a coincidence. He was also a banker. But she didn't leave him because he was cruel. In fact, it was he who kicked her out when he caught her with her lover. He also punched her in the face, which broke her nose. She sued him for this, right? Gina wanted to know. I'm afraid our girl was quite naive in those days. She didn't know that her husband was a banker for some pretty tough guys in the import business, if you know what I mean. Apparently, some of these guys visited her and explained that if she wanted to keep the rest of her face intact, she had better take her husband's offer and get out of town. They apparently explained it clearly because, according to my friends from the Miami police, the next day she was on a plane. I guess she used her compensation to get into Wharton, Gina said, remembering what Ben had said. Her brother chuckled. Her flight from Miami may have stopped at Philadelphia International Airport, but that was the only thing that brought her closer to UPenn. She attended Florida Atlantic University for a couple of years, and that was the end of her formal education. That bitch, Gina growled. She was leading Ben by the nose this whole time. I can't wait to tell him what she's up to now. Take your time, sister, Marco said. Lying a couple of times to look better in front of a potential husband is not a crime. If that were the case, we'd have to arrest half of Match.com quotes users. As for treason, what evidence do you have? Yes, what you heard in the parking lot sounds suspicious, but there could be another explanation. Besides, your patient is already clinging to sanity with all his might. Are you sure you want to loosen his grip? You need to take it slow, girl. Gina took a deep breath. I guess you're right, she said reluctantly, but I'll be watching this woman like a hawk. I didn't like her at first sight, and everything you told me makes her even more suspicious to me. Marco smiled slyly at her. You're just jealous that she found Ben before you. I'm not jealous. He's just a good man who needs help, and he's definitely not getting it from his wife. Of course, Gina, of course, he said, still grinning. The next morning, Gina still didn't know what to say to Ben. The conversation she overheard was certainly provocative, but she had to admit that it was not straightforward. And Ben is so vulnerable now, she thought. As soon as the shift handover ended, her mobile phone rang, and, pulling it out of her pocket, she saw that her brother was calling. I'm warning you, Marco, I don't want to hear any more of your jokes this morning. This is not a joke, Gina. We've just been informed that Perry Burgeon was found dead at his home from a suspected heart attack. I thought you should know about it. Oh my God, Marco, this is terrible. I guess I should tell Ben, but it would be very hard for him. Perry was his best friend. But still, I don't want him to find out about it any other way. Damn, damn, damn. When she entered the soft room, Ben was sitting quietly on the floor. He looked up, saw her, and a brief smile flashed across his face, but then he sank back into apathy. These are all medications, Gina thought, hating their effect. She came and sat down next to him, taking his hand in hers. Ben, I have bad news for you. When she finished, he began to moan. I can't believe Perry died. He was here, in this room, just yesterday. Why? He groaned again, and Gina noticed that he was sweating profusely. She looked worriedly at his face and saw that his eyes were unfocused. No, he suddenly shouted. Stop it. Then he began to ramble incoherently, his face contorted with fear. The charge nurse must have heard him because her voice came over the intercom. Is everything okay, Gina? Should I call Ed? Not yet, Gina shouted back, almost pleadingly. Let me stay with him a little longer, maybe it will help. Okay, Gina, but don't take any chances, said an impersonal voice. Ben writhed on the soft floor. Gina moved closer to him. It's okay, Ben. I'm here. Nobody will touch you. He continued to make unintelligible sounds, but Gina thought they were less agitated than a moment ago. She reached out and began to stroke his back. He flinched, but did not try to move away. Encouraged, she continued to pet him, purring soothing words to him. He moved blindly, his head poking at her thigh. He stood up and then laid his head on her lap. She held his head with her left hand and stroked his back with her right, singing to him like a mother comforting a frightened child. Gina was so focused on trying to calm him down that she lost track of time. Eventually, she realized that he had fallen asleep. Carefully, she pulled herself out from under him and placed a foam pillow under his head. Then she quietly walked to the door and left, locking it behind her. Are you okay? The nurse on duty asked her alarmedly. Didn't he offend you? No, why did you think that? The woman silently pointed to her face. Gina hurried to the ladies' room and looked in the mirror. Only then did she realize that her makeup was smeared from tears. She watched Ben for several hours, but he continued to sleep. Finally, late in the evening, he began to move, and when Gina noticed this, she hurried back inside. Ben raised his head, still sleepy, and looked at her blankly. Then something clicked, and a look of despair appeared on his face. It happened again, didn't it? We were talking, and suddenly everything started going crazy. I saw your face melt, and there was a strange taste in my mouth. I tried to warn you, but only colors came out of my mouth. He looked at her helplessly. I'm really crazy, huh? Gina squeezed his hand to emphasize the importance of what she wanted to say. Ben, can't you see, this time everything was different. Yes, you had one more episode, but it didn't last long. And you came out of it on your own. We didn't have to calm you down or tie you down. I don't know what's going on clinically, but I have to believe it's a sign of improvement. It didn't seem like an improvement to me, Ben said bitterly. My brain has stopped working again. I wanted to work the same way as before. Then he fell silent, as if pondering what had happened. But it wasn't as scary as last time, and I wasn't as scared. It was still scary, but somehow I felt like I could get through it. Gina didn't say anything, but she had a happy feeling inside. This episode was much milder than the previous two, and the fact that he was able to come out of it on his own seemed very encouraging to her. And to be honest with herself, she was glad that she could help him cope. Scylla couldn't do this, an inner voice whispered to her, but she brushed the thought aside. When her shift ended, Gina stayed later to review Ben's notes again. She was amazed that his recent episode was so different, but she couldn't find an explanation for it. She reread his entire file, hoping to find at least some clue. She checked his blood tests especially carefully, hoping to find some imbalance or deficiency that might provide an explanation. Finding nothing unusual, she eventually gave up and left. When she returned home that evening, she was surprised to see Marco waiting. What happened, big brother? The diner stopped feeding the cops, she asked with a smile. This time, however, Marco was in no mood for jokes. I came because I wanted to hear what happened to your patient today. Gina's smile disappeared as she told him about the patient's latest episode. But I helped him, Marco. I was able to calm him down, and he came out of this state much faster than the last 2 times. I think that's a good sign. Marco looked at her intently. Nurse, I know I'm not a doctor, but I have to tell you that your patient is taking something forbidden. Listen, it all adds up. The sudden onset, the wild hallucinations. He's clearly had some bad trips. But they're not all the same, Gina countered. His episode today was very different from the previous two. Did you tell him about Burgeon? Asked Marco. Yes, Gina answered reluctantly. Well, here is the answer. He had a flashback caused by stress. This is a fairly common occurrence. Marco, I'm telling you, he doesn't accept anything. He was given all sorts of tests when he had his first episode. Nothing was found. Okay, what type of testing was done on him? He asked. Urine test, of course. This is what the federal government requires. Nothing was found. Marco nodded. And how soon after he went crazy was this test done? He asked. Gina remembered, trying to recreate the notes she had recently reviewed. Well, his first episode started around 9 o'clock on Saturday night. He was kept in a padded room until Sunday when he was taken to the main hospital for testing. Then they took all kinds of pictures. If I remember correctly, the blood and urine tests weren't done until after he was returned to Longview. So it could be 24 hours or more, Marco said in a knowing tone. So what? Gina answered. A urine test can detect it even days after taking them. But not this kind, Marco said. This stuff can leave the urinary system in just a couple of hours. Seeing Gina about to object, he raised his hand. Look, I know you're a medical expert, but I'm an expert on substance testing. So how long after his second episode did they wait to run tests again? They didn't do them again. There was no need. He was in the hospital. Everything he consumed came from there. He couldn't get any drugs. Are you absolutely sure he didn't get anything from outside the hospital? Nobody but Scylla Mitchell. She also brought him a glass of coffee from Starbucks. But if someone mixed this in coffee, half the hospital would lose their temper. At Scylla's name, Marco became wary. Does he put anything in his coffee? Sugar, cream, one of those fancy additives? Only sugar. Here is the answer, he said with confidence. It came in sugar packets. Then we have to do something, she said anxiously. Quiet, take your time. All of this is just your and my guesses about what could have happened. On the other hand, we have a reputable psychiatrist who says that I am completely wrong about what happened to Ben. And even if his wife really manipulated her husband into continuing the affair with his partner, how will you prove it? That guy is now just a corpse in the morgue. For now, all you can do is continue to observe. Gina shook her head. I guess you're right, but I don't like it at all. Marco gave her a stern look. Only one thing, little sister, be careful in this madhouse. Do you know what I mean? She nodded, dissatisfied. The next day, coming to work, Gina again found herself in a difficult position. What to say to Ben? She felt it would be a mistake to raise her suspicions for fear of upsetting him again. She had already seen what the news of Perry Burgeon's death had done to him, and she didn't want to cause another episode. She also didn't want to ask questions about Scylla. As far as she knew, Ben had no doubts about his wife. For Gina, filing charges could be a risky move that could alienate him. In the end, she decided that their conversations should be calm and as normal as possible. However, her brother's words left her feeling anxious and unable to relax. 2 days later, something happened that really increased her paranoia. In the middle of the day, the nurse on duty stopped Gina and told her that she should take Ben to Dr. Adenauer's office on the 6th floor. This order was so unprecedented that Gina asked the nurse to repeat it. Neither of them could remember a patient ever being sent to the 6th floor, and this raised alarm bells in Gina. To buy time, Gina asked the nurse to prepare Ben's wheelchair while she went to the ladies' room to get cleaned up. As soon as she entered the toilet, she grabbed her mobile phone and called her brother. Marco, there's something going on here that's really worrying me, she said. You must come here immediately. As she explained the strange order, Her brother spoke with doubt in his voice. What's strange about this? She tried to explain how this was out of line with normal practice and how it bothered her. Patients never go to the sixth floor ever. I don't know what's going on, but after everything that happened, I feel very uncomfortable, Marco. Something is clearly wrong here. Please, Marco, please. She could almost picture him shaking his head. Gina, I can't just barge into the doctor's office and demand an explanation. This trick could cost me my job. And besides, I have a lot of work to do here. Sorry, sister, but I just can't leave. I'm scared, Marco, she said, but he had already hung up. She put the phone back in her pocket and looked at her face in the mirror. Come on, Gina, it probably doesn't mean anything. Besides, no matter what happens, you have to be strong for Ben. You don't want to scare him into another attack. When she came out, she was a little successful got over. The charge nurse had already found a wheelchair, so Gina took it and opened the soft room door. She then came in to explain their excursion to Ben as best she could. He was curious about the visit to Dr. Adenauer's office, but was puzzled by the sight of the wheelchair. It's hospital policy, Ben, Gina reassured him. That way you can't fall and sue Longview for negligence. We don't want anything to happen to you. Ben reluctantly agreed. When the elevator stopped on the sixth floor, Gina rolled it out. This was her first visit to the administration floor, and she looked around with interest. Unlike the terrazzo on the floors where she worked, this one had thick carpet that made it quite difficult to push a wheelchair across. They're definitely not expecting patients here, she thought with alarm. As they neared the end of the corridor, she was struck by Ed opening the double doors to Dr. Adenauer's office. Ed, what are you doing here? She asked nervously. She always felt uncomfortable from the gaze of the big orderly. I'm here to make sure there won't be any disturbances here, he said with a smirk, stepping aside to let her through. At first Gina didn't see anyone, but then she noticed Dr. Adenauer talking to Scylla Mitchell on what appeared to be a large balcony. Come in, Ben, Adenauer said joyfully. I'm so glad you were able to join us today. Bring him here, nurse, so we can all sit here and enjoy the afternoon sun. At Adenauer's signal, Gina rolled Ben onto the marble floor towards the balcony. As Ben stood up, his wife came over and gave him a quick hug. To Gina, it didn't seem like a gesture of affection, but she kept her opinion to herself. Ben, Scylla, and Dr. Adenauer sat down at a small table on the balcony, and Ed stood next to the entrance, leaving Gina standing undecided. This is a celebration of sorts, the doctor said solemnly, so I think we should serve drinks. No alcohol for me, Ben said quickly. No, of course not, said Adenauer. I know your preferences, Ben. We have coffee for you and tea for Scylla and me. He turned to Gina. Everything is in the kitchen. Bring it for us, nurse. Gina was outraged that she was being treated like a waitress. They had already tried to use her like this more than once, and she quickly put everyone in their place, but in these circumstances she restrained herself and went in the direction indicated by the doctor. Walking into the small kitchen, she was confused by what was happening. I wonder what they're celebrating, she thought. It all seemed strange. Looking around, she noticed cups and saucers arranged on a silver tray. A kettle of hot water sat on the stove, and next to it stood an expensive coffee maker with a full jug of fresh coffee. As she poured water into the cups with tea bags and coffee into the remaining cup, she noticed that sugar packets were already on each saucer. She was about to take the tray to the balcony when a terrible thought came to her. What if sugar had been mixed in? The thought terrified her, but before she could think of anything, Dr. Adenauer called out to her impatiently. After Gina put the tray on the table, Scylla quickly reached out and put the cups and saucers in their places. Dr. Adenauer nodded approvingly and then looked at Gina. Thank you, nurse. That's all. You can return to your post. Leaving Ben alone with these people was the last thing Gina wanted to do. Shouldn't I stay to help Ben? She asked desperately. Adenauer's expression became hard, and in an authoritative voice he said, We will take good care of your patient. Now go and close the door behind you. Gina turned and reluctantly walked towards the door, desperately trying to think of what she could do to help Ben. Without thinking of anything, she left, closing the doors tightly behind her. Ben watched what was happening and clearly began to get nervous. "I don't understand, Dr. Adenauer. Why am I here? What's happening?" "We'll explain everything in a minute," Scylla suggested. "But first, let's enjoy our drinks and this beautiful autumn sun." As the three drank their drinks, Adenauer took the opportunity to describe his vision for Longview Hospital and brag about some of its accomplishments. When he finished, he looked at Ben curiously. "This is all impressive, Dr. Adenauer, but I don't see how it concerns Scylla and me." Scylla and the doctor exchanged a quick glance before Adenauer turned to Ben again. "The fact is that there are always challenges to any great vision, and there are always those who are unable or unwilling to see the opportunities. For example, in the case of Longview." "What Dr. Adenauer is trying to say," Scylla interrupted, "is that he is a much better psychiatrist than a manager." Adenauer looked at her with indignation, but she continued, "I am afraid that the doctor's great plans have run into financial difficulties. The hospital is experiencing short-term but extremely serious cash flow problems. Moreover, other lending institutions refuse to provide the hospital with loans that could support its solvency. In short, if someone doesn't give him a serious loan soon, his hospital will go under." "I think this is an exaggeration of the situation," Adenauer said, but Scylla did not pay attention to him. "Community First Bank could meet the hospital's needs, but of course they don't make those loans," Scylla continued. Ben shook his head vigorously. "That's right, we serve completely different clients. We never issue such loans." "That's true," Scylla said, "unless there is a change in leadership at CFB that brings in a new philosophy. But this could only happen if the previous management was somehow incapacitated, forcing a replacement." "What are you saying, Scylla?" Ben asked with shock. "Scylla, I don't like this conversation," Adenauer said. Scylla ignored both of them. Looking at Ben, she continued, "Once Dr. Adenauer helped me find you incompetent, it was easy to manipulate poor lovelorn Perry Burgeon into doing what I wanted. Unfortunately, Perry lost his patience and didn't want to listen to reason, so I had to get rid of him." "Scylla, we didn't agree on this," Adenauer said anxiously. "I don't like all this." Before he could say anything else, Ben jumped to his feet. "Oh my God, Scylla, I can't believe it. Did you do this to me? Did you kill Perry? Who are you?" She smiled coldly and harshly at him. "I am a woman who knows what she wants and how to get it, and now I want Bank Group to acquire CFB and make me very rich. Unfortunately, our negotiations have encountered an obstacle. Bank Group is concerned that the power of attorney I have may be revoked and the deal may fall through. To resolve this issue, Dr. Adenauer, and I must make sure that you never regain your abilities." Ben felt cold sweat appear on his forehead as he realized the meaning of Scylla's words. "What are you planning now?" he asked anxiously. "I'm afraid you're going to have another episode, Ben, and this time it's going to be severe. In your delirium, you will jump from the balcony and fall to your death." "You can't do this," Ben screamed in horror. "Actually, I already did," she replied calmly. "The sugar in the coffee you just drank has been mixed with a drug, and the effect will begin any minute. Look at you, you've already started to sweat like a pig. Soon you will be completely helpless. And then our great friend Ed will help you try to learn to fly." Ben felt Ed's heavy hands press down on his shoulders, pushing him back into his chair. "No, let me go," Ben shouted and began to struggle, screaming with all his might. At the same time, he felt another attack begin. Suddenly, the office door swung open and Gina ran in. "What are you doing with it?" she exclaimed. "Let him go." Adenauer was horrified by Gina's sudden appearance, but Scylla remained calm. "Well, well, isn't this touching? Our little nurse is trying to save her patient. I wondered if you had lost your professional distance from my husband, and now I see that I was right." "She heard everything," Adenauer shouted hysterically. "What should we do now?" "Actually, I think it's for the best," Scylla replied calmly. It will be a great story. A caring nurse tries to save her patient, but in the end she dies along with him. All those detailed records you kept will document how devoted you were to him, as well as how he became a psychopath. We will make a martyr out of you, my dear. At that moment, Adenauer let out a loud, inarticulate scream, causing everyone in the room to turn and look at him. No, no, leave me alone, stop it, he shouted. His arms began to flail as if he was trying to fight someone off, and his head turned sharply left and right as if he was trying to escape from something invisible. Don't touch me, he shouted in horror. Then, while the others looked on in amazement, the doctor suddenly jumped to his feet, climbed the railing, and fell screaming from the balcony. Sorry, sorry. I didn't know it would happen like this, Gina said plaintively. The others turned to her in amazement. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want Ben to use that sugar, so I replaced it with Dr. Adenauer's sugar, she admitted. Ben began to groan, feeling the beginning of a flashback, and then sank limply into his chair. Ed growled at Gina, pulled a knife from his pocket, and walked toward the terrified nurse. Seeing him approaching, she screamed, "Don't you dare touch her!" A voice shouted behind her, and Marco ran into the room, gun at the ready. The big man saw him and turned to attack his new opponent. Marco fired, but the bullet seemed to have no effect. He shot again, and then a third time. He then took a step back, tripped over the wheelchair, and fell to the floor. He moaned once and then fell silent. Scylla was the first to come to her senses and quickly began to move towards the door. But Gina noticed this and grabbed her hand. "You're not leaving, bitch," she snapped. Realizing that there was no way out, Scylla straightened up and tidied up her clothes. "Officer, I want you to arrest this woman," she said, pointing at Gina. "You heard her admit that she mixed the drug with poor Dr. Adenauer." "It's a lie," Gina exclaimed. "She tried to put it on Ben. And this man," she said, pointing to Ed's body, "tried to kill me." "Nonsense," Scylla quickly replied. "Ed was a hospital employee who tried to protect Dr. Adenauer from what he believed to be an attack. And this man over there, who is clearly mentally unstable, is my husband, who was treated by Dr. Adenauer." Gina calmly crossed her arms and looked coldly at the woman she came to hate. "Oh, is that so?" she asked. "We'll find out now." With these words, she rushed to the kitchen and returned a moment later with a mobile phone. "I left this here when you tried to send me away, and it recorded everything that was said here. I wonder what the court will think about this, Scylla." The attractive woman stood silently, staring angrily at her opponent. While Marco walked towards Scylla to handcuff her, Gina rushed towards Ben, who was still sitting with his head down on the chair. Walking up to him, she gently took his hand. "Ben, what happened?" she asked quietly. He raised his head and looked at her in bewilderment. "What's happened?" he asked weakly. "It seems that stress triggered another flashback for you," Gina replied softly. Recognition flashed in Ben's eyes, and he straightened up. "Oh God, I remember. Scylla killed Perry, and she was going to kill me. She was the one who mixed something in with me." He stared at Gina, expecting to see his own shock in her expression. But instead, he saw a joyful smile, and his face reflected bewilderment. "Ben, listen to yourself," she said with emotion. "You overcame the flashback. You were only in this state for a few minutes, and now you are fine again. You really are getting better." With these words, she hugged him, and he responded with happy relief. When Gina returned home from work 2 weeks later, she was happy to see her older brother there. She hugged him tightly. "My hero," she said. "Enough, enough," he replied, although it was obvious that he liked her continued gratitude. "It will never be enough," she said with feeling. "If you hadn't come on time, I might already be a red blur in the hospital parking lot." He shuddered and became serious. "I heard you, you know. On the phone, I heard you say that you were afraid, and I immediately returned. I couldn't leave my little sister." She hugged him again, with tears of gratitude in her eyes. After dinner, Gina suggested that her daughter go play in her room because she wanted to get the latest news on the case from her brother. but she didn't want her 5-year-old daughter to hear the conversation. As soon as Angela left, Marco told Gina and his mother the latest news. He told them that Scylla had been indicted by a grand jury, but she hired some famous lawyer and pleaded not guilty. How can she do this? Gina was indignant. I have a recording of her detailing the entire conspiracy in Adenauer's office. There's no way she can dispute that. Marco shrugged. Her lawyer is trying to argue that this was all a privileged conversation between doctor and patient. I've never heard of such things being privileged, but even if they are, we have plenty of other evidence against her, and we continue to collect them. I don't think she'll be able to escape punishment. Marco shook his head with an ironic smile. You know, I could almost feel sorry for Scylla if she weren't a psychopath. She was a real intriguer, but her every intrigue encountered obstacles. She married Ben thinking he would be her ticket to luxury, but she became disillusioned when Ben turned down Bank Group's takeover offer. So Scylla decided to have been declared insane with the help of Dr. Adenauer, and she seduced Perry Burgeon to convince him to agree to Bank Group's offer once Ben was eliminated. So Burgeon was aware of the whole plot? Asked Gina. Everything except killing Ben, Marco replied. Burgeon's wife told us that Burgeon was always jealous of Ben, and all the public praise for him only increased this envy. In any case, when Scylla started flirting with him, Burgeon was in her arms. He thought she loved him, so he went along with her scheme to eliminate Ben. So after Scylla got Ben declared insane and Burgeon became CEO, what went wrong? Apparently, Burgeon became greedy. He had both the title of Ben and his wife, and he did not want to wait to show it to everyone. This became a big problem for Scylla because she knew that people would start asking questions if their relationship became known. So she decided to get rid of Burgeon and become CEO herself. So she thought she could do whatever she wanted with the bank. Wait, I thought you said Burgeon's death was ruled a heart attack, Gina countered. Marco didn't give up. Not surprisingly, the initial autopsy revealed nothing suspicious. Burgeon was eventually found lying on the floor, fully clothed, with no visible wounds. When the medical examiner opened it, his heart showed clear signs of a myocardial infarction, so the case was closed. But now the DA has a court order to exhume Burgeon's body, and this time they're going to take a deep dive into what they find in his system. There are many drugs that can cause a heart attack. I heard the medical examiner suggests it was digitalis. Burgeon was already in bad shape, so it's not surprising that this was fatal for him. So she put poison in the sugar packet again? Gina wanted to know. Marco shook his head. That's how we think it happened. Burgeon took her to his house the night you overheard their conversation in the parking lot. His wife was out of town, so when they arrived they had sex. He probably fell asleep after that, which gave her the opportunity to administer the lethal injection. By the time he felt the needle, it was too late. Then, when it was finished, she was able to put it back on and leave it there. Pretty cold-blooded, isn't it? Gina shuddered. At this moment, their mother, who had been listening to the conversation all this time, spoke up. I still don't understand. Who did Scylla have an affair with? Perry Burgeon or Dr. Adenauer? I'd bet both, Gina quickly responded. This woman is willing to do anything to get what she wants, so another lover wouldn't be a problem for her. Marco shrugged. She may have had an affair with Adenauer, but she refuses to answer any questions. Adenauer is dead, so we don't know for sure. But even if she wasn't having an affair, she still had powerful leverage over him. Adenauer desperately needed money to keep his hospital afloat. Scylla found out and offered him a loan in exchange for his help in getting Ben declared mentally ill. Then, when Burgeon became a problem, we think Adenauer helped her with him too. After we finish checking the hospital records, I'm sure we'll find that Adenauer was the one who supplied her, Marco added. So, he continued, just when she thought she had everything under control, Bank Group pulled out of the CFB acquisition due to uncertainty about Ben's condition. It was then that Scylla decided that Ben needed to be removed for good. By that time, Adenauer was already so deeply involved that he had no choice but to go through with it. Marco looked at his mother and sister with an ironic expression. Scylla's plan was like cancer. It continued to grow and spread until it got out of control. And even with all this, she could have pulled it off if it weren't for Gina. Gina blushed and shook her head in denial. It's not like that, Mommy. Marco figured out what was going on and showed up just in time to save the day. Their mother hugged both children and held them warmly. All I know is that I'm very proud of you both, she said proudly. At that moment, their celebration was interrupted by the doorbell. Esposito's mom went to see who had arrived and returned a moment later, followed by Ben Mitchell. Out of the corner of his eye, Marco saw Gina smile widely when she saw who it was. I hope I'm not intruding, Ben said awkwardly, but this is really the first chance I've had to come and thank you. He was holding a large box of calla lilies in his hands. Gina, I don't know how to express my gratitude to you for everything you've done for me, but I decided to at least start with these flowers. They are beautiful, Ben. Gina accepted them happily. Thank you. Ben turned to Marco with a smile. I also owe you a lot, but I didn't bring flowers. I'm glad for that, Marco replied, and the others laughed. At that moment, Gina's daughter came down the stairs. Angela was playing in her room and came to see what the noise was. Gina called her over and pointed at Ben. Say hello to Mr. Mitchell, baby. This is the man I told you about. Seriously, Angela extended her hand to Ben, who dropped to one knee to shake it. Are you the one my mother loves so much? She asked innocently. Angela, Gina gasped, blushing with embarrassment. Ben smiled widely. I hope so, Angela. The girl looked at him appraisingly. Do you love my mother? She asked. Gina was about to intervene, but Ben raised his hand to stop her. It's okay, he said. He then turned back to Angela. With a serious face, but with a twinkle in his eye, he said, You know what? I'm crazy about her. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even click to the next one.